Good day, Matrix. This is going to be a video that looks at paper 1, and we are going to look at question 1, 3, 4, and 6 of the paper. I do not believe that you should be going and doing question 2 and 5, as they are the most tricky to answer. So I'm going to give you 4 options. I want you to remember that in your exam, you are going to be asked to make 3 choices out of the 6 possible questions, and you must do either 2 source-based and 1 essay, or 2 essays and 1 source-based. However, I want you to listen carefully to me when I say you should actually do 2 essays and 1 source-based for this paper. My suggestion to you is that you do the China essay as well as the US Civil Rights Movement essay, and do the Cuban Missile Crisis as your source-based, or do the Black Power Movement as your source-based. So that is my suggestion to you to succeed in this paper. We will be looking at these 4 topics. Please stick with me. I know this is going to be an extremely long video, but it looks at the whole paper in an attempt to prepare you thoroughly. Right, so the first thing we're going to discuss is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And just a quick definition of a couple things. A superpower is a state with dominant position and is able to exert power over the rest of the world on a global scale. Communism is a political and economic ideology that positions itself in opposition to democracy. Democracy is a political system in which people have the power to elect their leaders. Capitalism is an economic and political system in which the country's trade and industry is controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. A Cold War is a state of conflict between nations that does not involve direct military action. A blockade is an act or a means of sealing off a place to prevent goods or people from entering or leaving. Mutually assured destruction, or MAD, is a principle of deterrence founded on the notion that a nuclear attack by one superpower would be met with retaliation by the other, and both attacker and defender would be annihilated and destroyed. The doomsday clock is a symbol that represents the likelihood of man-made global catastrophe, and containment is a US foreign policy adopted by Harry S. Truman in 1947, and it operated under the principle that communist governments will fall apart as long as they are prevented from expanding their influence. So when we look at Cuba, Cuba is an island that sits 90 miles or 145 kilometers from the coast of Florida. After the Spanish-American War, much of Cuba's commerce, such as sugar, was controlled by the USA. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrew Batista, who was the US-backed dictator of Cuba. Castro nationalized US industries, which caused the Cuban-American relationships to become hostile. And some of the reasons why the USSR was interested in helping Cuba was the fact that it wanted to help this new communist state. It wanted to get a launch base for intercontinental missiles, ICBMs, that was close to America, just as America had launch sites in Turkey and Italy. It wanted to test the strength of the US President J.F. Kennedy, and Khrushchev wanted to force Kennedy to bargain over the US missiles in Europe. So, on 14 October 1962, a US U-2 spy plane took photos of what was suspected to be USSR missile sites in Cuba. 20 ships from the Soviet Union were also bound for Cuba, and it was suspected of carrying missiles. The missile locations in Cuba was San Cristobal, Guanaje, Sagua La Grande. President Kennedy had 6 options. The first was an airstrike, which meant that they could target the missile sites and take them out and put them out of working condition, but it would run the risk of provoking the Soviet response in Berlin. He had the option of doing nothing. He could ignore the missiles, but this would then seem as though the USA was weak. He could choose diplomacy and negotiation, but once again, if the US entered negotiation first, they would have been forced into negotiation and therefore seen as weak. They could invade, they could send troops to overthrow Castro, but missiles would be able to be put out of action. However, again, it would cause possible retaliation. They could retaliate using nuclear weapons. However, as you've seen from the definition, mutually assured destruction prevented them from doing that because they knew that the USSR would just retaliate with nuclear weapons as well. On October the 25th, photos showed continued construction of the missile sites. October the 26th, Kennedy received the offer from the Kremlin saying that they would remove the missiles from Cuba if the USA would end the blockade and promise not to invade Cuba. On October the 27th, Kennedy receives a second letter demanding that the US also withdraw their weapons in order for the USSR to withdraw their weapons. On October the 28th, Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the Soviet missiles in Cuba, and the US publicly declares that it will never try to invade Cuba, and it secretly agrees that they will dismantle the missiles in Turkey and Italy. The outcomes of the Cuban Missile Crisis is that Cuba remains a communist state. It is heavily armed, but it is without nuclear weapons. The world saw the futility of the idea of mutually assured destruction, and it supported the theory of containment and coexistence because the alternatives were unimaginable. A permanent hotline was set up between the White House in the USA and the Kremlin in the USSR. And the USA and USSR negotiate a nuclear test ban treaty. Right, the next thing that we need to discuss is the Black Power movement. Now, I'm sure you have watched my Black Power video, but I'm just going to quickly run through everything again. The Black Power movement was extremely necessary because it grew out of the dissatisfaction of African American people with the civil rights movement. They felt that while the civil rights movement had achieved gains, they had not managed to change the livelihoods of African Americans, and that the economic situation African American people lived in was still poor and had not improved. The majority of African Americans lived in crowded ghettos, in poor living conditions, and many of them were unemployed and paid very low wages. Police brutality was also common, and so because the Black Power movement encouraged Black pride, encouraged Black excellence, and supporting Black businesses, as well as standing up and defending oneself from police brutality, many people started to turn to the Black Power movement. So those who supported the Black Power movement believed in Black self-pride, the idea of Black is beautiful, the promotion of Black interest, Black self-help, self-defense against racial oppression, the fostering of a distinctive Black culture. They believed in being self-sufficient, creating a self-sufficient Black economy. What I do need you to understand, though, is that the Black Power movement was not a specific organization. Many of the followers of the idea or the movement were followers of different organizations. For example, Malcolm X followed the Nation of Islam, while Stokely Carmichael originally belongs to the Black Panthers. So let's look at Stokely Carmichael. He was born in 1941. He moved to New York when he was 11. He was part of the civil rights movement and he took part in freedom rides. He was jailed for 49 days. He became the president or the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He moved to organize the organizations towards Black Power direction, and he wanted to exclude whites from the organization, and he did this in 1967. He believed that white people were the heart of the problem, that they had caused much of the problems within America, that they had instigated racism and oppression against African Americans, and so they should not be included in these movements to stop racial oppression. So in 1967, the SNCC expelled him, and so he joined the Black Panther Party in 1969. Stokely left the Black Panther Party and he moved to Guinea in Africa, where he renounced his affiliation with the Black Panther Party because of their willingness to start including and work with white people. It is here that Stokely Carmichael changes his name to Kwame Ture, and he becomes a committed Pan-Africanist. And Pan-Africanists believe that Africans should unite and that they should return to Africa. The next person we will look at is Malcolm X. He was born Malcolm Little in Nebraska in 1925. His father died when he was 6 years old, and his one uncle was lynched by white racists. When he was 13, his mother was sent to an asylum, and he and his 6 siblings were put into foster homes. At the age of 18, he had become involved in criminal activities, and so in 1946 he was arrested and found guilty of theft. He was given 8 to 10 years in prison, and while he was in prison, he converted to Islam. When he was released from prison, he joined the Nation of Islam, which was a Black Power movement organization. And the Nation of Islam believed that black people were superior to white people and that white people were devils. It believed that black people should not mix with whites and should create a black state in the USA, or that until they can go back to Africa. However, after a pilgrimage to Mecca, Malcolm X tones down his hatred of the civil rights movement, and in fact he leaves the Nation of Islam. Sadly though, Malcolm X is assassinated on 21 February 1965. His legacy and the reason why we remember Malcolm X till this day is because of his ability to raise the self-esteem of those he spoke to, of being able to increase people's self-confidence and their belief in themselves, his encouragement of people to stand up for themselves and defend themselves, and really what he taught people held true and stayed true to the messages of the civil rights movement. So, the Black Panther Party was originally called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and it was founded by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California, 1966. The initial aim of the party was to promote the protection of black people against police brutality. It took advantage of an old Californian law where people could carry loaded weapons as long as they were displayed and not pointed at anyone. They were revolutionary socialists. They had a 10-point program, and some of these points were very reasonable while others were debatable. So, Point 3 called for the reparation or compensation for slavery. Point 6 called for black men to be exempted from military service. Point 7 called for black people to form armed groups for self-defense against police brutality and oppression. Point 8 called for the release of all imprisoned blacks, as they believed that black people had not received a fair and impartial trial. The Black Panthers were not originally black nationalists, and they were prepared to accept the help of white people. However, this changed in 1966 when Stokely Carmichael became the honorary prime minister of the movement, and under Carmichael, the Black Panther Party would become black nationalist and anti-white. However, after his removal in 1967, it became a revolutionary international movement, and they were very socialist. The Black Panther Party indulged in many criminal activities such as drug dealing, prostitution, and extortion in order to raise money for their various social schemes. And they were involved in many altercations with the law. In these altercations, about 50 people died on both sides. The co-founder of the organization, Huey Newton, was convicted of murdering a police officer, and he was very proud of this. In fact, he even wrote a book about it. The Black Panther Party operated under survival programs, and they provided services to the African American community, such as free medical clinics, self-defense classes, first aid, drug and alcohol rehabilitation centers, classes on politics and economics, and the free breakfast program. Now, many of these survival programs were very good ideas. Medical clinics would provide free or affordable medical attention to African American people, self-defense classes aimed at teaching people to defend themselves not only against oppression from white people, but oppression and police brutality. Drug and rehab centers would allow people to become economically stable. Classes on politics and economics would allow African American people to start to exert their political opinions, and would also allow them to escape from poverty if they understood how economics works. And free breakfast programs for children ensured that when children went to school, they would have a full stomach, which would therefore ensure that they could concentrate. At its height, the Black Panther Party attracted the attention of the FBI, and J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI at this point, called the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to internal security. And this is because the Black Panther Party upset the status quo. They did not allow things to just be as they had always been. So when we look at the short and long-term gains, we get short-term gains such as greater racial pride amongst African people. Local black political groups were being established, black voters mobilized to support black candidates, and black studies programs were introduced in universities and colleges. The long-term gains would be that it increased the self-confidence and self-esteem amongst black people for generations to come. There was solidarity among the African American people. Social justice groups were established through the Black Panther Party, and they encouraged a greater cultural tolerance in the USA. Right, so the next two sections that we're going to look at are the essay sections, and we're going to be discussing China and the US Civil Rights Movement. So what I need you to remember is that with these essays, you are going to need to remember and keep in mind the question that you are asked. Throughout this section, I'm going to keep reminding you of what type of questions are asked and how to indicate in each paragraph, or how that paragraph links to the essay and the type of essay questions they ask you. So when we start looking at China under Mao Zedong, I want you to remember that the questions that they ask most often is, how were the policies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution successful or not successful? Now, please understand that these policies weren't successful. They led to famine and destruction of culture. So, let us go through these sections. Some background information is that the Chinese Communist Party was established in 1921. By 1927, it was involved in a civil war against the Kuomintang. Japan invaded China during World War II, and after the war, America made it clear that they supported the Kuomintang. However, the Civil War resumed in 1946, and in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party had become victorious, and so China became communist. Mao Zedong was the chairperson of the Chinese Communist Party from 1949 until his death in 1976. One of the policies that you need to be aware of is the 100 Flowers campaign. It was launched by Mao Zedong in 1956. In a statement about this, he said, "Let 100 flowers blossom, let 100 schools of thought contend." Through this statement, what he was trying to say was that the campaign would allow the Chinese intellectuals, philosophers, and scientists to express their views on the Chinese Communist Party. This aim was achieved, but many who criticized the way the CCP ran China, and these people believed that the Chinese Communist Party should not be allowed to rule on its own. And this caused a campaign in 1957 against these rightists to be launched. This campaign forced them to renounce their statements publicly, and they were sent to labor camps as peasants where they were to be re-educated, indoctrinated really into the communist way of thinking. About 1 million members of the Chinese Communist Party itself were expelled because of their opinions, and many believed that the purpose of the 100 Flowers campaign was to expose the enemies of the regime, not just in the citizenry of the country, but specifically within the Chinese Communist Party itself. Now, this links to the idea that although the 100 Flowers campaign did succeed in allowing people to express their opinions, it failed because as soon as those people did express their opinions, they were forced to take them back. And therefore, people were forced to stay silent in a regime that ruled them in a way that they did not agree with. The next thing we need to look at is the Great Leap Forward. Now, this is from 1958 to 1961. The Great Leap Forward was established in 1958, and the aim was to rapidly make China an industrial and agricultural rival to the West. It aimed to increase the food production for local and export use in order to finance this planned industrialization. Before 1958, China was mostly an agricultural country, with many peasants owning very small pieces of land. However, after this, previously privately owned farms owned by individual peasant farmers were made into larger areas of land which would be worked by state employees who were the previous owners of the land who had lost their ownership. Up to 20,000 families could be part of one of these communes. This was done in an attempt to increase food production. Each of these communes was also expected to produce steel in addition to grain. These communes were given huge quotas, which is targets that they had to reach, production targets that they had to reach, and they were expected to be achieved. Now, when we look at what the Great Leap Forward entailed and its consequences, I want you to really think of it in terms of this kind of table, what did it entail and what did each of these things cause. So the Great Leap Forward aimed to increase food production to finance industrial growth, but it caused peasants to be forced to work harder and eat less. Therefore, the production in the country slumped. The communes created were up to 20,000 families large, and therefore the consequence is that the communes were too large to work efficiently, and therefore peasants resented the loss of their property. The next thing that the Great Leap Forward entailed was that party cadres were sent to the communes to militarize the production, to speed up the production process, and to keep the peasants in check. And this meant that the Chinese Communist Party had to use force and terror in order to stamp out resistance. The next aspect of the Great Leap Forward is that the communes were expected to produce steel for industrialization. However, the steel that was created or made was very weak and poor quality, and therefore it also caused farmers to neglect their land. It's very simple. Because the farmers were expected to make steel, they weren't looking after the land, and therefore the crops were neglected. The communes were also expected to undertake their own water projects, building and digging dams to boost the agricultural production, and again, peasants were forced to work on these projects and leave their crops unattended, which meant that food rations were cut. And lastly, the Great Leap Forward set forth massive quotas for grain and steel production, and therefore the statistics were falsified to make it seem as though the project or the program was more effective and produced more than what it actually did in reality. Now, the Great Leap Forward was a failure, okay? It was a failure because 18 to 45 million people died as a result. It was a failure because peasants were advised to plant crops too closely together, causing the plants to die as they didn't have enough space. The result of the Great Leap Forward was a famine that was so vast that people ate whatever they could find. Worms, frogs, toads, and even cannibalism was recorded during this period of time. And I want you to understand that history is not something that we study to just study what happened in the past. If you look at China today, they are still under the Chinese Communist Party's rule, and therefore many peasants are still extremely poor, and therefore they still have to sometimes rely on these easily accessible ways of getting food. However, people became more desperate for food, so they had to settle for anything that they could catch. The Chinese Communist Party refused to acknowledge that it had made a mistake. When Defense Minister Peng Dehuai pointed out that the widespread famine led to such widespread loss of life. He lost his position, and later he was tortured to death during the Cultural Revolution. And the people of China refer to the Great Leap Forward as the 3 bitter years. Now, in your essay, this section, the Great Leap Forward as a failure, is your link to your topic. The essay is going to ask you about the success or the failure of Mao Zedong's policies. When we look at the Great Leap Forward, this is your link to that answer. The Great Leap Forward was a failure, and this is why. Then, the Cultural Revolution happened between 1967 and 1976. After the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, Mao stepped down as the president of the People's Republic of China, but he remained the chairperson of the Chinese Communist Party. He needed a campaign that would consolidate his power within the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore, in a grab for power, he appointed his friend and closest supporter as defense minister. This friend of his was Lin Biao, and what this did was, by making Lin Biao the defense minister, it gave Mao control over the army. Lin had created the Little Red Book, which consisted of some of Mao's thoughts, and this booklet helped to spread what is known today as the cult of Mao, who was seen as the all-knowing, wise leader of the Communist Party and the great helmsman of China. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao encouraged the youth to form revolutionary groups, which he called the Red Guards, and they were told to destroy the 4 olds: old culture, old ideas, old habits, and old customs. The youth were joined by older factory work and office workers who called themselves the Revolutionary Rebels. And both the Red Guards and the Revolutionary Rebels were supporters of what Mao called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. These groups went about destroying many old artworks and buildings, and many thousands of older people were killed or driven to suicide. These people included traditional teachers, scholars, intellectuals, and just a quick explanation of driven to suicide. Suicide is, in Chinese tradition, a protest against oppression. It is a way of saying, I refuse to live under your oppression. I have control over my life. Look at me, take that life that you think you owe. During the Cultural Revolution, schools and universities were shut down, and no education took place during that decade. Students joined the Red Guards, and mass rallies were held where students were encouraged to rid the Chinese Communist Party of anyone that could be seen as an enemy of Mao. Once again, they were encouraged to destroy the 4 olds. Mao's Little Red Book was used to mobilize the army and the youth to Mao's side and to target teachers and lecturers who were major targets of attacks by school children under Mao's direction. He called them capitalist intellectuals, and he said that these capital intellectuals will not be allowed to rule our schools. So they were attacked, as well as any member of the CCP who spoke out against Mao and his policies. Thousands of older people were just attacked and killed. Many people were sent to re-education camps where they were where they were forced to do hard labor and study the Little Red Book, so that they would be indoctrinated into the ideas and the thought processes of the Chinese Communist Party. In 1967, violent conflict erupted between the groups, and it became clear that the Cultural Revolution had become unmanageable. And because of this, Mao ordered the People's Liberation Army to restore order to the country. The People's Liberation Army sent about 20 million Red Guards to the countryside, where they were forced to labor as peasants in order to get them under control. And during the Cultural Revolution, China suffered huge economic losses. The industrial production fell by 30%, and the agricultural production fell as well. And this caused these economic losses in China. And I want you to understand that this is one of the major reasons, not just the terror that was used in China, but also the economic losses and the agricultural losses during this period that makes the Cultural Revolution a failure. In 1971, Lin Biao tried to overthrow Mao, but he failed. And in 1975, Zhou Enlai, who became the new prime minister, called for the 4 modernizations in agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology. And it is here where China starts to rapidly and quickly develop and become the powerhouse that we know it to be today. The second essay question that we are going to be looking at is the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement essay usually asks to what extent the civil rights movement was a success. And to answer this question, you really need to look at the different protest movements within the civil rights movement and how they were successful. What did they achieve through their protests? Okay, so let's get started. Segregation is the separation of people according to race or ethnicity. It can be about separating African Americans from whites, or about separating Hispanics from whites. It's all about separating races from one another. Before 1950, segregation was common and normal in the USA. Segregation deprived many minorities of their rights. Now, in America, there was 2 different types of segregation in America. The first is de jure segregation, which was common in the South, and it is segregation by law. The second type is de facto segregation, and it is segregation without laws. It is just segregation that is implemented by the society. Right, so non-violent protests included boycotts, hunger strikes, petitions, marches and demonstrations, and they really aimed to force change to happen. So with boycotts, they would refuse to buy goods and services in order to force change. Hunger strikes means to refuse to eat anything to get attention for your cause. Petitions is writing letters to ask governments or companies to change its policy. Marches and demonstrations means to get as many people as possible together in one place to get attention for your cause. and strikes means to refuse to work in order for your management or government to change policies. In the mid-1900s, the civil rights movement began to make major progress in correcting the national problem of segregation. The life for African Americans in the South before 1950 was controlled by de jure segregation, legal segregation through written laws, specifically through the Jim Crow laws, which was designated to separate blacks and whites from one another. The Plessy versus Ferguson law meant that things should be separate but equal. So the races should be kept separate, but they should be given the same facilities. And there was segregation of beaches, cemeteries, hospitals, restaurants, schools, transport, and so on. In the North and the rest of America nationwide, segregation from whites, either through law or just through custom, was throughout the United States. In employment, it was generally understood that the lowest paid jobs or the least desirable jobs was for African Americans, and it was also understood that last hired, first fired. The standard of living for African Americans was very poor. They had higher rates of illiteracy and poverty, shorter life expectancy, etc. They also had poor housing, and there were fewer black homeowners than white homeowners. And World War II, following the defeat of Hitler and his racist ideology, it encouraged African Americans to start expecting change within the United States. So, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had some legal victories in 1950. In the 1950s, the Sweat versus Panther case allowed all black law, which is allowed or said that schools in Texas violated the 14th Amendment because their facilities were unequal. The McLaurin versus Oklahoma State Regents, the University of Oklahoma was sued by an old student, George McLaughlin's because his constitutional rights had been violated when he was denied equal access to classrooms, the dining hall, and the library. And Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. This case challenged the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson. And the attorney, Thurgood Marshall, argued that the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, and it was unanimously decided that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. So what this just means is that it was decided that the policy of having separate but equal education was not allowed because African American and colored schools were not being given equal opportunity and equal infrastructure. So the first movement we need to really look at is the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955 to 1956. Rosa Parks is our heroine here. She was asked to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama in December of 1955. She refused and was arrested, and activists of the Montgomery Improvement Association began a bus boycott that lasted for over a year. This boycott was extremely important because it forced the US Supreme Court to rule that segregation of buses was unconstitutional, and this is a victory. For your essay, please remember the Montgomery Bus Boycott was successful because the US Supreme Court desegregated the buses. Right, then in 1957, Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and it is here that Martin Luther King speaks out in support of the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and they encourage nonviolent protest and resistance based on civil disobedience. Now, the Little Rock in Arkansas piece of history happens in 1957, and it is about the Little Rock Nine, who was enrolled at the Central High School, all-white school. These were 9 African-American children. The governor called out the Arkansas National Guard to block them. However, it was a success for the civil rights movement because President Eisenhower sent federal troops to the school who helped the students to gain access and also who kept them safe throughout that whole school year. In 1957, the Civil Rights Act is written or passed. It is the first federal civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction. It established the United States Civil Rights Commission. The civil rights violations were being investigated, and voting was protected by the U.S. Attorney General. Again, this is each of these that you need to remind yourself, this is successful because the Greensboro Sit-Ins of 1960 is extremely important because in 1960, 4 African American students from Greensboro, North Carolina, ordered a coffee and donuts at a Woolworth's lunch counter. However, the restaurant refused to serve them, and therefore they decided that in protest they were going to sit at the counter until they closed. And this sparked similar restaurant sit-ins along with read-ins at libraries and wade-ins at the beaches, etc. In 1961, we have the Freedom Riders. These were people who would get onto buses. The Freedom Ride consisted of people getting onto the bus and refusing to move, people sitting mixed in amongst one another, and some of these buses were set on fire. And one of the people that we learn about that was involved in these freedom rides was Stokely Carmichael, who would later become the Prime Minister of the Black Panther Party, which is part of the next paper. Now, Birmingham, Alabama was one of the most racially segregated places in America, and so especially in about 1963, Birmingham consisted of, or was considered, the most segregated city. So Martin Luther King joined a demonstration, and it is here that he was arrested. While he was in jail, he wrote the letter from Birmingham jail, and the Public Safety Commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, turned the fire hoses and police dogs on the protesters. This caused nationwide sympathy for the demonstrators, and therefore nationwide television and news coverage for the civil rights movement. In 1963, Kennedy has a television address. On June the 11th of 1963, John F. Kennedy spoke to the nation as a whole. He said that the civil rights movement was a moral issue, and he pledged equal rights and equal opportunities to all. He proposed that new civil rights legislation would be enacted, and he was supported by Attorney General Robert Bobby Kennedy, who was his brother. In 1963, on the 28th of August, we have the Washington March. It is here that Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. There were over 200,000 peaceful demonstrators, and the march was publicized nationwide over the television. In Birmingham, there was a church bombing in 1963 on September the 15th. The 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama was bombed, and 4 young girls were killed when this bomb exploded. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed in July, so the Civil Rights Act becomes law. It established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and the Justice Department could prosecute discrimination based on race, color, sex, or national origin, which meant that people could not be denied a job because of their race or sex. This also outlawed segregation in public, no more separate drinking fountains or facilities, and it required schools to desegregate. You need to highlight, make a note that this is one of the major successes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a major success because it establishes that segregation is outlawed. Then, in 1964, on the 21st of June, 3 civil rights workers went missing. They had gone to investigate the burning of a church, but they were arrested allegedly on speeding charges and held in secret at a county jail. The deputy there, who was a Ku Klux Klan member, alerted his fellow Klans members to the situation. The deputy then ordered the 3 men to leave town, followed their car, pulled them over again, and the Klansmen arrived and killed the 3 young men, buried them separately as one was white, and set fire to their car. This leads to J. Edgar Hoover launching an investigation into these 3 missing boys, and for 6 weeks there was a nationwide televised suspense about how the search was going for these 3 boys, young men really. Then in 1965 we have the Selma Montgomery March. It is launched on Bloody Sunday, March the 7th, 1965, by John Lewis, who led over 600 marchers over the bridge in Selma, Alabama, and they faced brutal attacks by the state troopers. Footage of this went nationwide on television, and therefore what it achieved was that March 15th, 1965, the federal voting rights law was announced on national television. Lastly, voting rights were achieved in 1962. The federal government could have election districts redrawn to halt racial gerrymandering, Gerrymandering is a technique used in American politics where they draw the voting lines, and it depends on how many areas you win, whether or not you win the election. Reynolds versus Sims was the legal principle of one person, one vote, which would ensure that the legislative districts were equal. The 24th Amendment happened in 1964, which outlawed poll taxes. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act was established and announced, and it outlawed literacy tests for people who wanted to vote. And the federal government was to oversee the elections and voter registration to ensure that no one was forced to not register to vote, or that no one was intimidated to not vote. And in 1975, this is extended to Hispanics as well. Right, guys, once again, I wanted to remind you about the structure of your essays. These essays are actually very simple. If you have looked at past papers, you will see that the China essay almost always asks, how was the policies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution successful or failures? And the Civil Rights Movement essay almost always asks, how was the Civil Rights Movement successful? So you already have all the content, you have all the answers. It's all about how you structure your answers. And I want you to remember that your introduction, you need to have a line of argument present there. Make a list of things that you are going to discuss. So for China, for example, this essay will discuss the causes and effects of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution to prove that both these policies were failures. I have not told you what my line of argument is going to be. I have told you that I am going to prove they were failures. That is my argument. So make sure that your line of argument is clear. Each of your paragraphs, you need to ensure that you use the PEEL method, P-E-E-L. P-E-E-L. Point, example, explanation, link. I want you to understand that every paragraph must link back to the topic. So every paragraph, I want you to say, therefore, it can be seen that the Selma Montgomery March was successful because it was nationally televised and it encouraged people to join the movements of the civil rights movement, which ensured that the civil rights movement was successful. Whatever you might want to say there, but you link every single paragraph back to your essay. Again, my suggestion to you is do not fall into the trap of thinking that source-based are easier than your essays. Prepare 2 essays and do 1 source-based. My tip to you for the source-based preparation is that you should go and make sure every single question you check the mark allocation. 2 times 2 means that you need 2 facts. Each fact is worth 2 marks. And my last tip for the source-based section is that you should definitely go and use bullet points. So if it's a question that's 2 times 2, you know it says 2 facts, so there must be 2 bullet points. If it is a comparison or a how these two contradictory, whatever the question might ask, then you need to have 1 bullet which compares source A to source B, and a second bullet that also compares source A to source B. Matrix, I wish you the very best for this exam. I pray that you are all ready. I hope that you are given the knowledge and the strength to see this through, and I wish you only the very best in your future endeavors. Good luck!